Hi, everyone. Welcome to our discussion of Chapter 33. In this chapter, we're completely switching gears. The last several chapters, we've talked about how the macroeconomic system behaves in the long run, over the course of 5 years or over the course of 10 years. We talked about economic fundamentals, the really key foundational drivers of the economy over that kind of a time frame. But now in this chapter, we're switching gears and we're going to talk about the macroeconomic system in the short run. And we're going to talk about when the economy bounces around up and down in the short run. One way you can ask this question that kind of provides the foundation of this chapter is to say, why do we have recessions? Or on the flip side, why do we have periods of really strong economic growth in the short run? And another way of wording it is, why do we have cyclical unemployment? Let's switch just real quick to my notepad. I want to just show you this. We talked about this at the beginning of the macroeconomic section, the macroeconomic section of the course, back in the GDP chapter. Show this figure, time and GDP. And we showed kind of the stylistic diagram. The stylistic diagram exaggerates the real fluctuations, but it does so to make the point. Right? This is the real path of GDP. It bounces up and down. We have this long run natural rate, right? The dotted line represents Y bar. That's the natural rate of output, the long run equilibrium. The long run equilibrium represents, or it reflects, the fundamentals of our economic system. And then the actual path of GDP follows along with those fundamentals, but it bounces up and down. We have these periods of rapid economic growth down here, then we have these recessions that you see in there as well. The long run equilibrium, that's what we've been focused on in the last few chapters. We've been focusing on these long run fundamentals that are centered around getting the long run equilibrium to grow gradually over 5-10 year period. When we talked about the production and growth chapter, the savings and investment chapter, the monetary system chapter, we were all worried about, in those chapters, we were worried about making sure that those systems are strong and healthy in order to get that long run equilibrium to grow at a healthy pace over the long run. But now we're getting down to the more nitty gritty. Why does the economy fluctuate up and down like this? This is an especially interesting time right now since we're in a recession as we speak, unfortunately. As this class is going on, we're in a pretty tough recession, one of the toughest recessions we've seen in a long time, the highest unemployment rate that we've seen in a long time, etc. So in this chapter, we're going to develop, again, another economic model to understand why these deviations occur and why recessions occur, why these little downward movements occur, why do recessions occur. And furthermore, this long-run equilibrium, we're defining it by GDP, but it also corresponds to the natural rate of unemployment. The long-run equilibrium goes hand in hand with the natural rate of unemployment. And so cyclical unemployment, deviations in unemployment around that natural rate, cyclical unemployment corresponds to the movements in GDP up and down, above and below the natural rate. Does that make sense? In this chapter, we answer those questions: why do recessions occur, and why do we have cyclical unemployment? So I'll stop screen share, and I'm actually going to share back over now to my PowerPoint. So I'm kind of a little bit schizophrenic today in terms of going back and forth between screen shares. In this chapter, we're going to focus on what we call Keynesian theory. You see right here, Keynesian theory. It's named after this economist named John Maynard Keynes. Everything we've done so far has been in the world of classical theory. We haven't said that, and we haven't got into nearly enough detail to really justify talking about that to a large extent. But what we've done so far has focused on those fundamentals. It's focused on the long run. It's focused on what we might call classical theory. And before the Great Depression, that was all that economists talked about. I mean, that was it. Classical theory was the extent of our focus. I mean, for one thing, before the Great Depression, we didn't have great data. We had really bad data. So we didn't fully understand how much the economy bounced around in the short run due to that lack of data. But then we also just thought, it's more important to focus on the long run fundamentals and get that down, get our long run fundamental understanding down before we worry about details about short run movements. But then when the Great Depression comes along, that depression was so severe and it lasted for so long that John Maynard Keynes kind of led the way in driving economists to move their focus away from that long run orientation to a more short run orientation to understanding how we bounce around in the short run. So John Maynard Keynes really revolutionized the way that economists think, or the focus that they have, shifting from long run to short run. It was an entirely, a complete paradigm shift in terms of the kinds of questions that economists were asking. The key difference between classical theory and Keynesian theory is, in classical theory, we assume that prices and wages are fully flexible. We haven't said this before in the class, but we've been assuming that all along, just in a regular supply and demand model, right? We show, okay, demand goes up, prices adjust, the economy reaches this new equilibrium. And that is what will happen over time. That is what will happen. Prices will be flexible. The supply and demand model is an accurate depiction of what happens over time. But in the short run, if we're just talking about the course of months, prices aren't going to move immediately. There can be rigidities in the economy that prevent prices from being fully flexible. And, that can lead to kinks. That can lead to problems in the economy. So Keynesian theory really focuses on the short run environment where problems can arise in the economy that prevent prices and wages from being fully flexible. So those wage and price rigidities are the defining feature of the model that we present in this chapter. And furthermore, those wage and price rigidities are fundamentally the reason why the economy can fall off balance in the short run, right? I mean, the economy is supposed to be on that long run equilibrium. In that figure that I just drew a second ago, I mean, it's kind of in quotes. You can kind of take this. When I say supposed to, I'm being somewhat loose here. But I think it's still fair to say the economy is supposed to be on that long run equilibrium. That's where we should be based on our fundamentals. But wage and price rigidities can cause us to fall off of that long run equilibrium. Wage and price rigidities present basically kinks in the economy that can mess us up and put us at a level that's, put economic output or unemployment at a level that's higher or lower than where it's really supposed to be. So in this chapter, we're not using the supply and demand model anymore, but instead we're using the model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate just means we're taking everything in the economy and putting it together into one model. Aggregate supply and demand rather than supply and demand that's reflective of some single market. So here's the model that we have. On the horizontal axis, we're not looking at the output of one particular good. We're looking at the output of everything in the economy. We're looking at GDP. That's why we have Y here, as always, to represent GDP. And on the vertical axis, we're not looking at the price of some particular good. We're looking at the price level, the overall level of prices in the economy. What do we use to measure the price level that we see on this vertical axis? I hope you remember it's the CPI. CPI, or the GDP deflator. Those things that we talked about back in that second chapter that we considered in the macro portion of the course. So the output of everything in the economy, GDP, and the overall level of prices in the economy. We have aggregate demand, the demand for all the stuff in the economy, the demand for all the consumer goods in the economy, the demand for all the investment goods in the economy, the demand for all the public goods and services in the economy. Aggregate demand is downward sloping. And then we have the aggregate supply curve, but we're calling it more specifically the short run aggregate supply curve. You'll see why I'm distinguishing between short run and long run aggregate supply in just a second. But anyway, short run aggregate supply curve, the supply of everything in the economy. I will tell you right now, I think it's going to be hard to communicate this fully over a video because it's fairly complex. This model is way more complex than it looks. The fact that it looks like the regular supply and demand model, right? The regular supply and demand model isn't all that complex. Obviously, it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy to understand. It's pretty workable. But this model is far more complex than the regular supply and demand model. And I think I may have a hard time communicating that in this somewhat limited format. This is the fundamental difference. I mean, it's pretty different that we're talking about the output of everything in the economy rather than the output of one particular good. That's different, but even more different is this. On the horizontal axis here, we have a real variable, GDP. That's a real variable. But on the vertical axis, we have a nominal variable, the price level. So what's really, really different here is that we are mixing and matching a nominal variable and a real variable. Now, in the regular supply and demand model, when we had price on the vertical axis, we didn't say this because it was beyond the scope of our discussion back early on in the course, but we weren't just talking about the nominal price. We were actually talking about the real price. We were talking about the inflation-adjusted price in the regular microeconomic supply and demand model. So we were still talking about a real variable and a real variable on the two axes. But in this chapter, we are switching gears pretty dramatically and mixing a nominal variable, the CPI, versus a real variable, real GDP. And that's where the real difference comes in. Oops. So aggregate demand. Why does aggregate demand slope downward? In a microeconomic model, it's pretty obvious why demand slopes downward. But here, it's not quite that obvious. This is the thing. We're talking about why does the quantity of stuff that you would want to buy altogether move in response to a change in the CPI? The thing is, if the CPI moves, then generally speaking, that's going to change output prices and it's going to change your wage. All right, so if the CPI doubles, generally speaking, that's going to mean that you have this basket of goods that you buy. Just imagine this basket of goods that you buy every month. If the CPI doubles, then the number of dollars that it takes to buy that basket is going to double, but your wage is also going to double most likely. And so if your wage doubles and if the price of that basket doubles, then why would that matter to you? It wouldn't matter. So it shouldn't be clear why aggregate demand slopes downward. So you have to think in a more subtle way about why aggregate demand actually slopes downward. And so one reason is what we call the wealth effect. So the story I gave you a minute ago, if the CPI doubles, price of the stuff that you buy doubles, your wage doubles, shouldn't matter. But the one thing that does come into the mix is the money that you hold. The cash that you hold. If the CPI doubles, then that eats away at the value of those dollars that you have in savings. That's why you would cut back on your demand for goods and services in response to an increase in the CPI, because it eats away at the value of your cash. That's what we call the wealth effect. Okay, that's a reason why CPI goes up. People cut down on how much stuff they want to buy. because it eats away the value of their cash. Not the income that they have, because their income should keep up with it, but their cash. I'm not going to explain. I'm going to try to keep this video brief, because if we're not careful, this video could be 3 hours. This is a long topic right now. But another reason is the interest rate effect. It's described in the text. I'll just have you read it in the text. But the interest rate effect is a secondary reason. What factors shift aggregate demand? The first factor is animal spirits. So Keynes viewed aggregate demand as being very, full disclosure, Keynes did not use the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. Keynes had a different model that he used, and so we're kind of putting words into his mouth retroactively when we say he viewed aggregate demand as relatively volatile. He used a different model, he used different terminology, but that's still a correct representation of what he believed, even though he used different words and different models. Anyway, Keynes believed aggregate demand was pretty volatile. He believed that just waves of pessimism could come through the economy and make people want to cut back on how much they spend. He used the term animal spirits just to reflect the idea that aggregate demand of the economy is kind of like a wild animal. It's unpredictable. It's hard to understand. I mean, you're looking at a wild, rabid dog walking through the woods. You don't know where it's going to go. You don't know if it's going to go left or right. You can't make any sense out of it. You can't predict it. Keynes thought aggregate demand was like that. A good example is something like a terrorist attack. The September 11th terrorist attack almost 20 years ago is a good example. The terrorist attack rises. It just comes out of the blue. Nobody was expecting it. Nobody knew it was going to happen. And all of a sudden, people cut back on how much they want to spend. You know, all else equal in the economy, there's no change in any other variable, but people just get scared. They get worried. They think, oh, what's going to happen? Are we going to be in a war? Is there going to be a recession? Who knows what kind of uncertainty we face? People cut back on their spending. Suppose on September 10th, you're planning a trip to Hawaii for Christmas break. Well, the attack happens and you say, oh, maybe we should put off that trip. You just want to hold off on that money that you were going to spend to put it in a rainy day fund because you're worried, you're scared. That's a really good example of animal spirits. It's just some random thing that happens in the economy that causes people to cut back on how much they spend. So a lot of examples fit into that animal spirits category, unpredictable things that can shift aggregate demand of the economy. Another factor is taxes. If the government raises taxes, you have less money, left over, after your tax withholdings from your paycheck. That's going to cut back on your spending. That's going to cause you to cut back on your spending. I think that's pretty understandable. That's an easy factor to understand. If the government lowers taxes, on the other hand, you have more disposable income, you have more take-home pay. That'll cause aggregate demand to rise. People will want to buy more stuff at any given level of prices when government cuts taxes. Another one is the business outlook. Animal spirits and taxes. Animal spirits mostly refers to demand for consumer goods, consumption demand. Taxes can refer to consumption demand or investment demand, either way, the demand for investment goods. But then the next one, the business outlook, mostly refers to the demand for investment goods. Remember, I'm going through Y equals C plus I plus G, right? Consumer goods, investment goods, government goods. But the business outlook refers to investment goods. If the business outlook is really strong and positive, businesses want to take advantage of that. Businesses want to grow and be ready to capitalize on a healthy economy in the future, so they buy more investment goods today. If the business outlook becomes weak, if businesses become pessimistic, businesses don't see that it makes a lot of sense to purchase investment goods, they cut back. That lowers demand in the economy. The next one is interest rates. Interest rates apply to consumer goods and investment goods. If interest rates fall, it's cheaper. It's cheaper to buy stuff on your credit card. It's cheaper to buy a home mortgage. It's cheaper to buy a home because a home mortgage would be cheaper. It's cheaper to buy a car if you're borrowing for that car. Anything you're buying on credit is cheaper if interest rates fall. So if interest rates fall, then that's going to raise aggregate demand and vice versa. And the last part's government spending. Government is part of that aggregate demand as well. If government is buying public parks, if government is buying kind of roads, or if government's thinking about enhancing roads, adding road infrastructure, whatever, if government is putting in, new lakes, new recreation facilities, if government is thinking about increasing police protection or public schools, anything like that, all that is part of GDP as well. So if government spending increases in any of those areas, that boosts aggregate demand as well. Does that make sense? All those factors shift aggregate demand back and forth. Animal spirits is probably the most talked about one. These random, unpredictable waves of pessimism and optimism that go through the economy, but taxes, business outlook, interest rates, and government spending all move aggregate demand back and forth. Here's one more piece of the puzzle. We have this, we have what we call the long run aggregate supply. This is weird because the long run aggregate supply curve isn't really a curve. It's a focal point. So the basic mechanism here works the same as it does in any regular supply and demand model, right? Wherever aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply meet, wherever they meet, that's where the economy is at any given point in time. But we have this concept that the intersection of aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply will tend towards this long run equilibrium, will tend towards this long run aggregate supply. So the two may meet up here, the two may meet down there, they may meet over here, they may meet here, they may meet wherever, but their intersection will tend towards the long run aggregate supply. The long run aggregate supply represents the natural rate of output. In that figure that I drew at the beginning of the section, the long run aggregate supply corresponds to that dotted line. And then the intersection of the two other curves, the intersection of the two blue lines, that can occur above, that can occur below the long run equilibrium, it can bounce around, but it will tend towards that long run equilibrium. The natural rate, that's just simply what determines the long run aggregate supply curve. It's grounded here at the natural rate of output, and that natural rate is based on things that are completely beyond this chapter. The natural rate's based on those things we talked about back in the long run production and growth chapter: human capital, physical capital, natural resources, and technology. The long run equilibrium is determined by those fundamentals. The long run equilibrium has nothing to do with the way in which the economy is bouncing around over the course of a few months. Okay? So why does the aggregate supply curve slope upward? It's the same idea as before with aggregate demand. It shouldn't be obvious why aggregate supply slopes upward. Because generally speaking, if the CPI goes up, then for a business, that's usually going to mean that the business's output price goes up and its input prices go up, and it shouldn't make any difference for the business. Shouldn't matter. If the CPI goes from 100 to 120, inflation's 20%. If all of your input prices and if all of your output prices rise by 20%, then what difference does it make? So you have to think more carefully about why supply slopes upward. The first reason is the sticky wage theory. The sticky wage theory is central to this short run model, okay? Sticky wage theory is kind of central to the way that Keynes thought about the economy. Here we're talking about those price and wage rigidities that I mentioned a second ago. So suppose this happens. Suppose inflation jumps unexpectedly. Okay? Inflation jumps unexpectedly. Well, it's true that a lot of workers are going to have longer term contracts, right? In general, there would be wage pressure for wages to jump to keep up with that inflation. But there's going to be a lot of long-term contracts for labor out there. Everybody, I mean, not everybody, but a lot of people have wage contracts. I have a wage contract. I mean, my wage is set for a year. If we have inflation at the beginning of the year, it's going to be a full year until my wage can adjust to catch up to that inflation. Unions are especially notorious for this. Unions can have wage contracts that last up to 5 years. So if inflation jumps unexpectedly, then what does that do to wages? It lowers real wages because real wages are stuck at that older level. Inflation jumps unexpectedly, real wages have been reduced until those contracts expire, until those wages have time to adjust to the new price level. So when inflation jumps unexpectedly, businesses find, oh, we're paying lower wages all of a sudden. They want to take advantage of that. They want to hire more workers and crank up output in the short run until those wages have time to adjust. That's one reason why we have a positive relationship between the CPI, between the price level, and how much output firms want to provide. Because if inflation jumps unexpectedly, businesses find themselves in an advantageous position. They want to capitalize, they want to increase output. The sticky price theory is the same idea, except it refers to just other input prices. So suppose you're an auto manufacturer. You don't just buy steel every day, okay? You have a long-term contract for the steel, right? You have a contract with the steel mill that says, okay, we're going to buy steel from you over the next 3 years, and this is going to be the price. And it can have, that contract can have adjustments for expected inflation in it anyway. But the issue is if inflation jumps unexpectedly. If inflation jumps unexpectedly, then the real cost of that steel falls, right? Because that steel isn't able to keep up with inflation because of that contract, because of that price stickiness. So price level jumps unexpectedly. Auto manufacturer finds that its steel is now cheaper. Auto manufacturer wants to crank out output. Okay, so those are two reasons. These aren't alternative theories. These are two different reasons that both get us to the same point. That both get us to an upward sloping aggregate supply curve. And then the last reason is the misperceptions theory. The misperceptions theory says that, in the short run, like if you see prices moving around and if you see, inflation happening, you don't fully always understand how high inflation is and kind of how the price in your market, if you're a business, how the price in your market is moving. You can only disentangle inflation and real price movements after the fact. In real time, it's hard to really correctly perceive price movements. Oh, is this just inflation, or is this a move in the relative price, the real price of the good in my market? So if inflation jumps unexpectedly, people could misperceive that price increase to be an increase in the real price of their product before they've had time to really understand everything that's happening with their input prices, et cetera. And people could misperceive that inflation to be a real price increase, and that could send businesses a signal to increase their output. That's a third complementary reason why aggregate supply slopes upward, why firms would increase output in response to a jump in inflation. What factors that shift the supply curve? Anything that shifts the long-run equilibrium will shift short-run aggregate supply as well. So if we do have kind of a quick technological improvement, if we do have a quick improvement in human capital, if we have a quick improvement in physical capital, those things will shift short-run aggregate supply as well as that long-run equilibrium. Mostly those kind of things are not what we're talking about in this chapter because those are more gradual, more long-term factors. But if they do happen to shift in the short run due to some kind of unusual circumstance, they will also shift short run aggregate supply. And then the extra reason is the expected price level. An increase in the expected price level will lower aggregate supply and vice versa. Here we have this equation. Output in the economy, this is actually supposed to be the quantity of output supplied. This is supposed to be an equation that represents the aggregate supply curve, but even though it doesn't really say that here with the y. The quantity of output supplied equals the natural rate plus alpha, some parameter, times the difference between the actual price level and the expected price level. The amount of output that firms are willing to supply is grounded in the natural rate plus A times the difference between the actual and the expected price level. I want to go back to my notepad and I want you to just think about this. Okay. So what I'm showing you here is, the regular real GDP on this axis, price level as measured by the CPI on this axis. Here we have the long run focal point, and here we have the short run aggregate supply. So this intersection here, is the expected price level. The short run aggregate supply curve intersects with the long run equilibrium at the expected price level. The thing is this, those theories that I said about sticky wages, sticky prices, and misperceptions, ask yourself this: do those theories make any sense if inflation is as expected? Okay? Do those theories make any sense if inflation is as expected? The answer is no. Those theories only come into relevance when inflation moves around in an unexpected way. If inflation jumps or falls unexpectedly, those theories have no relevance if inflation is as expected. So if inflation is as expected, right, remember this, output supplied equals Y bar plus A times price level actual minus price level expected. Okay, this is the same equation we just showed just 1 second ago. So this is the thing. If prices are as expected, right? If prices are as expected, this parenthetical term is 0. So the quantity of output supplied is equal to the natural rate. Okay, so if prices are as expected, that means the actual price level is right here. And then go over to the aggregate supply curve and see how much the quantity supplied is. And it's just equal to the natural rate. That's how it should be. Okay, if prices are as expected, the economy is working properly. Okay, if prices are as expected, the economy is working properly and we're in good shape. Output should be the natural rate. The problems that arise in the economy arise from sticky wages, sticky prices, and misperceptions. And those things only pop up when prices are unexpectedly high or unexpectedly low. So if prices become higher than expected, right, quantity of output supplied will be over here, and we'll be in an overheated economy. Output will be above the natural rate. Output will be above what's normal. If prices are unexpectedly low, quantity of output supplied will be over here, will be below the natural rate, we'll be in a recession, we'll be in a grim economy. But if prices are as expected, we'll be right here, we'll be at the natural rate, the economy will be on balance. The economy will be in good shape. Okay? That's how this works. What is A? What is this little number here, A? Does anybody get that? I hope you do. What is A? A is simply the slope of the aggregate supply curve. Okay, I hope you get that. I hope and pray you get that. Just look at the equation and it should come to you. But A is just simply the slope of the aggregate supply curve. And anyway, this has to be the case. So if the expected price level rises, we'll talk about why that can happen later. I'm not going to go into it right now because that's going to come up in our examples as we illustrate. But if the expected price level rises, well, that'll cause the aggregate supply curve to shift down this way. It'll shift vertically on the page to the left, but it's, of course, as you know, a drop in aggregate supply. And of course, aggregate supply will increase if the expected price level rises. Let me just see. I'm going to break this video. I think we're going to make this a two-parter. We're going to stop right there for now, and we'll come back with part B after you have a chance to kind of catch your breath, and we'll go through a bunch of examples. They'll be really cool examples.